Earlier this year, I was diagnosed with depression and anxiety by my doctor. A number of stressful events were happening in my life, and I was feeling very exhausted, apathetic, nauseous, anxious, tearful, and unable to sleep. I went to see my doctor because I wanted sleeping pills, but she recommended I also take the antidepressant Citalopram, 20 milligrams per day. She also gave me some Valium to take in the first week in case of side effects. On the first day of taking Citalopram, I found I was extremely sedated and apathetic in the morning and afternoon, but by the evening I was verging on manic, ended up writing nonsense until 4 a.m. It took hours to get to sleep that night, even with the sleeping pills, but was then hard to wake up. The next day I felt extremely nauseous. I was sweating so much that water was running off of me. I was shaking to the point where I couldn't roll a cigarette, and I felt so paranoid and anxious I couldn't leave the house. I felt like wet bugs were crawling all over my skin, and my jaw was very tight. I also found I couldn't stay still and would have to pace around even when trying to watch TV. By lunchtime, I was in paroxysms of misery and became genuinely suicidal and self-harmed for the first time in my depression. I then started to hallucinate and thought I was seeing birds and rats everywhere. By the late afternoon, the misery had passed somewhat, and I became manic again. I went to see my friend and couldn't stop laughing or sit still for several hours. Again, I couldn't sleep that night. I was taking Valium, probably 6 2-milligram doses in a day, but it had no effects. The next day I took only half the dose, but the effects continued exactly as the previous day. My friend suggested I try drinking, which helped the mania somewhat and potentiated the Valium, but I was still suffering from extreme physical reactions, depression, and anxiety. In total, this went on for 10 days, as I kept thinking the effects would eventually wear off. I believe I was actually psychotic at points and in real danger of suicide had my friends not helped. In the end, the counselor I was seeing was so worried within minutes of seeing me. My face was so tight and I was sweating, shaking, and moving so much. He asked me to go and see my GP immediately that very day. There is also a history of bipolar disorder in my family, although I've never shown any symptoms before, and I was concerned it was triggering it in me. GP took me off the drug and tried to prescribe me more Valium at a higher dose and tricyclics. By this point, I was so terrified by the whole experience, I declined. Later that week, I was diagnosed with anemia, which may have caused a lot of the problems all along. I also started taking 5-HTP, and I found that a combination of this and vitamin and mineral supplements have left me on a much more calm and even keel. Within 2 weeks of iron and tryptophan, I felt better than I had done all year. Afterwards, I spoke to 3 other people I knew had taken Citalopram and found that all of them had had similar and terrifying experiences, especially the sweating, suicidality, and psychosis. Interestingly, all 3 also have bipolar family members. I would suggest extreme caution in taking Citalopram if you have a family history of bipolar disorder. Maybe start on a lower dose. The side effects I experienced were quite extreme and potentially dangerous. I wish I'd gone back to my doctor earlier. I have found tryptophan an excellent remedy for mild depression, and there is plenty of placebo-controlled double-blind evidence out there that can work better and quicker than conventional antidepressants. It also helps with come-downs. I had just run out of alprazolam, marking the end of a 2-month binge. This was not a new situation for me. I had undergone withdrawal from benzos many times over the years. I knew exactly what to expect, but nevertheless, I would do anything to avoid it. I had not been without alprazolam for a day when I came across a drug I'd never used before, citalopram. Normally I don't concern myself with antidepressants, but I thought it would be worth trying it out at that moment to see if it could alleviate my withdrawal symptoms once they began in force. There was still enough residual alprazolam in me to help me feel more or less tolerable, but by the 2nd and 3rd day without benzos, I knew I would be experiencing the peak of the withdrawal. I then did a bit of research into citalopram pharmacology just to make sure there were no obvious dangers of taking it during or following benzos. I found nothing to suggest a danger, so I took 20 milligrams. Citalopram, being an SSRI, would not really begin to be effective for a while, so I expected nothing that first day. Since it didn't seem like the citalopram would be a miracle cure for benzo withdrawal, I didn't have much hope that it would. I resigned myself to the imminent withdrawal. At this point, I must mention that another person, my girlfriend Kay, was going through the same things that I was. We had always shared benzos, and therefore we both ran out simultaneously. She too took 20 milligrams of the citalopram. That night, the night between the first and second day without alprazolam, we could not sleep at all, and we were beginning to hallucinate a bit. We watched TV all night until dawn. So far, this was all as expected. We had done this many times before. We had both forgotten that we had taken the citalopram the previous day. Then, in the morning hours of day 2, horrible things occurred. We were lying side by side watching TV and chatting when suddenly, Kay's body went rigid. Her back arched, arms folded to the chest, and legs stuck out rigidly. Her face was frozen and her eyes were wide open, pupils massively dilated. I asked her what was wrong, but she was utterly unresponsive and simply jerked and made spitting sounds. I had never seen anyone have a seizure before, and I was more terrified than at almost any other time in my life. This had never happened to either of us ever before. I began screaming for her to respond or wake up and try to move her body around. I don't know how long she was out, but after what seemed like an eternity, she began to breathe more slowly and the convulsions ceased. She began blinking and became less rigid, more or less relaxed. At last, she woke up, utterly unaware of what had happened. The seizure never repeated. Shortly afterwards, another completely unexpected affliction affected us both, myself more than her. We both began to notice a peculiar sensation in our backs and necks, a stiffness, almost a pain. Over the course of an hour or so, it developed tremendously. I had the worst of it by far. Before I knew it, by that afternoon, the muscles along my spine and wrapping around my thorax to my diaphragm and abdomen had clenched or cramped so tightly and painfully that I simply could not even remotely bring myself into a standing position. Indeed, every movement of my body that involved those muscles was incredibly difficult and painful. Even rolling over in bed was a trial lasting about a minute. The only time that there was no pain was when I lay completely prostrate. It felt as though I had a perpetual stitch in my side, back, and abdomen of monstrous proportions. For a whole week, I lay in bed except to use the bathroom, which I managed by crawling extremely slowly on my hands and knees. After about a week and a half, I was barely able to vaguely stand erect by clasping my knees in both hands and awkwardly shuffling my feet while maintaining an absurd-looking hunchback posture. Only after 3 weeks fully passed was I able to stand up with great discomfort. Even months later, I still feel a painful ache lingering in those muscles. Kay had the same pains but much milder, thank goodness. She never lost the ability to stand and walk about. We have no adequate explanation for what happened. Foolishly, perhaps, we never went to a doctor to seek treatment or explanation. Because similar things happened to both of us at essentially the same time under the same circumstances, we assume that a powerful interaction occurred between the post-alprazolam effects on the body's chemistry and the mere 20 milligrams of the citalopram, somehow allowing the latter drug to act quite unpleasantly. We've both recovered more or less, and will never use alprazolam or citalopram again. I take Lamictal for depression. It's a new drug for me, something I've only been on for 3 months. Everything has actually been great, with one caveat: I cannot sleep. When I do sleep, my dreams are extremely disturbing and vivid. This is new for me as I usually don't even fully remember my dreams upon waking. Anyways, my psychiatrist prescribed me Xanax to help me, 2 milligrams. It was and does work great, no problems, except I don't want an addiction or habit with using it. And I can unfortunately admit that I enjoy the drug a bit too much. So my therapist suggested Trazadone, My psychiatrist agreed that it would be helpful just as a sleep aid and not an antidepressant, so I was prescribed 50 milligrams, one pill to take before bed. The name sounded familiar. I happened to find it in my house, an old expired bottle of the stuff, same dosage. This should have been a warning. I couldn't remember why I stopped taking it the first time. It must have been because I didn't like the feeling of it. It's not at all like Xanax where I get comfortable and go to sleep naturally. No, this feels like someone whacked me over the head with a frying pan, except without the pain, of course. So before I continue, I would like to explain that at least 3 years ago have passed since I first tried this drug, and what I am about to describe I surely would have remembered had it occurred the first time. I took the pill at 9:30 p.m., got sleepy, everything is fine. The last time I saw the clock before going to sleep was 10:30 p.m. I awoke at 11:30 p.m. feeling off. I was suddenly wide awake, and I noticed that I couldn't feel my toes. They had gone completely numb. I had no idea what was happening and became very agitated. My stress shot through the roof, and every hour I kept checking my toes to see if they were blue. They weren't. I laid in bed for hours and hours, and my body got more and more numb. By midnight, both of my feet were entirely numb, as were my fingers. Somehow around 3 a.m., I finally began to get tired and figured whatever was happening would pass. Nothing numb was blue, so I wasn't oxygen deprived. The last time I looked at the clock was 3:08 a.m. I fell into that limbo state between being awake and being asleep where I was dreaming. All of a sudden and instantaneously, the dream was replaced with black and white flashing, extremely rapid, with a tone in the background at around I'd say the 13,000 hertz range, extremely loud. I could feel my entire body thrashing, shaking extremely quickly and intensely in place. In my head I was screaming. In the black and white flashing I could see myself. My face was distorted and disturbing looking. I tried desperately to move, to jerk myself out of it. I could feel myself straining, really trying to move my right arm. It barely moved. My body was shaking too intensely. In my mind, I was screaming for help, and in reality, I could hear myself attempting to do the same, but all that I could hear was a weak moan like that out of a wounded animal. Then it stopped, my body still shaking a bit, my sides and muscles hurting from the intensity. I looked at the clock. It was 3:12 a.m. Right as I had finally begun to fall asleep, I had a non-epileptic seizure. I did not return to sleep. The numbness did not subside until around 3 to 4 p.m. the next day. I surmised that the reason this happened now and not then was because now I have high blood pressure. That explains the numbness, sort of. My doctor and psychiatrist agreed that I had some sort of allergic reaction to this drug. This is a 1 out of 50,000 occurrence in people who take Trazadone HCl, so it's not exactly common. But I wanted to document that this happened, that this can happen, and that it happened to me. I have seen a lot of things that terrify me to my core, but nothing so much as those 4 minutes of complete and utter helplessness. I have had a grand mal seizure before, and by comparison, I wish I could have had it this time too. At least then I wouldn't have been conscious and completely aware of everything that was happening. "11 months ago, I went to a psychiatrist and was diagnosed as having a severe anxiety disorder. The psychiatrist prescribed me 25 milligrams of Prozac daily and sent me on my way. Over the next few months, I had very little contact with him, approximately 15 minutes every 3 weeks or so, and received no real counseling. I was working in a customer service job which I found extremely stressful, and I became more and more anxious as the months went on. I started spiraling into severe depression and was filled with this total apathy about life. By November, I couldn't take my job anymore, and I quit and went to live with my family. My dosage was increased to 50 milligrams, and then a week later up to 100. The next few weeks are a blur of sleeplessness and depression. I started hearing voices and hallucinating, while having very strong thoughts about suicide and killing my family. On New Year's Eve, I found myself outside my mom's room with a knife and freaked out. I called the police and was taken to the hospital. I saw a psychiatrist there and was told that my thoughts were due to repressed emotion and that I was in no real danger, so they sent me back home. A few days later, I moved out to a friend's house. Each day was a battle with myself not to attack him, and I was having vivid dreams of slitting his throat, so I decided to run away. I went to the city and smoked a lot of pot. I was hoping to get some stronger drugs and kill myself with them, but I ran out of money. I went to stay with my auntie and was there for a few days, but my insanity was relentless, and all I knew was that I had to get away from everyone. I stole my aunt's car and went randomly driving, trying on a number of occasions to kill myself without success. I stopped taking the Prozac and eventually wound up on the side of the road with no fuel and no money. I was then contacted by my family and was taken back home. Luckily, the effects soon wore off, though I still have less intense homicidal and suicidal thoughts pretty much constantly. Thanks to Prozac and the way that psychological drugs are just handed out like candy by the medical professionals, I have a criminal record and have been alienated by my family. The moral of the story: I think prescription drugs are dangerous. If I had been warned, I would have recognized the symptoms and would not have gotten to the point of almost murdering my family. If I do a quick search of the internet, I can literally find hundreds of stories like mine of people who take antidepressants, especially Prozac, and harm themselves or others. Don't just assume that doctors are totally responsible or have your best interests at heart. Research for yourself and find out exactly what it is you are taking, and hopefully, you won't end up like me. So I was bored one night and was out of weed, so I decided to try something new. I was just going to go for something at the store, and I had already tried DXM and had a pretty bad trip, so I wasn't going to go that route. I decided on a box of caffeine pills to see how that would be for a change. I first took 4 of the 200 milligram pills with little effect, so I decided to finish off the pack with the last 4. About a half an hour later, I started to feel really bad, so I tried to make myself vomit up what I had taken. I ate right before this, so I had a hard time puking it up. I tried drinking a few cups of water to help it come out. Nothing. I don't remember puking much, but I got a little out of me eventually. This is where the bad part came into play. I guess I was near the front door at one point, and I had a seizure. I remember my mom coming in the door, and I guess I woke up then. Boy, did I feel terrible. I couldn't talk right, see right, and could barely walk. I stumbled my way to the toilet and puked my guts out. I guess my mom knew something was wrong and called 911 while I was in the bathroom. The next thing I knew, the EMS crew was in my house and led me to the awaiting ambulance. I was still out of it, and the EMS asked for my name and birthday, and I couldn't even remember what it was. I got to the hospital at about 11:30 p.m. where they put me in a room at the ER, and my parents arrived shortly after. I came to a bit later and was still throwing up. I guess I had another seizure sometime while in that room because I woke up some hours later with an IV in me and was in a new room. I spent the next 2 days in observation. I was sore all over from my muscles tightening up on me, but they wouldn't give me any pain pills because they knew of my abusing of the pills. I know now that Zoloft and caffeine do not mix and could cause these seizures. Now I have to wait 6 months to be able to drive again due to state law. Be careful, be safe, and don't abuse pills.